Hitler's plan to crush Britain seemed unstoppable, with the Luftwaffe poised to reduce cities to rubble and morale to dust. One wrong move could have ended the nation overnight. The radar network, fighter squadrons, and civil defenses were stretched to breaking point, and every decision carried catastrophic risk that no one fully appreciated. Britain's survival was hanging by a thread, unseen cracks threatening collapse, and yet few understood just how close the edge really was. In the summer of 1940, Britain faced a peril so immediate that few fully grasped its weight at the time, and even fewer would admit later how fragile the nation truly was. The conventional narrative speaks of a confident island standing alone, yet the reality was far more precarious, a precariousness born not merely of numerical inferiority, but of an intricate interplay between overconfidence, misjudged intelligence, and a leadership stretched across multiple crises. For as Hitler turned his attention westward, the Luftwaffe's precision and scale revealed a strategy designed to exploit the smallest cracks, to find and widen the fault lines in both military and civil defense. And the early raids over southern England were not just tests but probes, each one exposing how quickly a misstep might have cascaded into catastrophic failure. While the radar network, though advanced, remained limited in scope, its operators fatigued, interpreting a constant stream of signals that often blurred into uncertainty, and the Royal Air Force, already dispersed and under-resourced, faced the psychological strain of knowing that every sortie could determine not merely the fate of a squadron, but the survival of London and other urban centers, while the civilians below, unaware of the precise strategic calculations, endured air raid warnings that stretched nerves thin, their shelters and blackout measures providing only partial protection, the illusion of safety a fragile veneer over the very real possibility of destruction. And in these early days, the government's messaging wavered between reassurance and stark warning, conveying a confidence that masked the strain on leadership and the limits of preparedness, which in turn amplified the tension. For citizens sensed instinctively that a single failure, be it a misrouted patrol, a delayed response, or a misjudged attack, could tilt the balance irrevocably, and yet the country endured, not through heroics of individual legend, but through the quiet, sustained performance of systems under extreme pressure, each radar station, each gun battery, each fire watcher contributing to a web of resilience that was at once delicate and essential. And it is here, at the intersection of illusion and reality, that the story of the Blitz begins. Because what Hitler hoped would crush a nation instead illuminated the fragility, ingenuity, and resolve of Britain's defenses, a contradiction that would define the weeks and months to follow. A reminder that power is never absolute, and that strain magnifies every flaw, while the populace adjusted to a new rhythm of survival, moving from disbelief to tense adaptation. And the air above became a theater where the consequences of delay, misjudgment, and overreach played out daily, the RAF responding in stretched formations, the Luftwaffe probing relentlessly, each encounter a test of endurance, strategy, and the hidden margins upon which the nation balanced. Yet even amidst this tension, there was a growing awareness, however subtle, that survival was possible if systems held and improvisation met necessity. And as this early period unfolded, historians later recognized that the prevailing sense of imminent collapse was not paranoia, but grounded in the stark reality that Britain's position was anything but secure, that every advantage was contested and every decision consequential. And it is against this backdrop, where illusion meets the sharp edge of reality, that the story of Britain's fight to endure Hitler's Blitz must be understood, not as a tale of mythic heroism, but as a measured account of pressure, fragility, and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary structures under extraordinary strain. And if you wish to follow this story in its full depth, understanding the fine line between collapse and survival, then I invite you to continue exploring with us here on Backhand Index, pointing right Britain at war. Hitler's strategy during the Blitz was not a haphazard onslaught, but a meticulously calculated campaign designed to break both military capability and civilian morale. Yet conventional accounts often soften the precision with which the Luftwaffe operated, obscuring the degree to which Britain's very survival hinged on rapid, often improvised responses. The German High Command understood that sustained bombing could force the British government into concessions without the need for immediate invasion, and to this end, each raid was conceived with dual objectives: to destroy critical infrastructure and to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of an island still reeling from earlier setbacks in Europe. Yet even as their plans unfolded, limitations in intelligence, navigation, and aircraft endurance created openings that, though small, would prove decisive, because the human operators at every level were forced to act under severe time pressure. constantly recalibrating against an enemy whose intentions could never be fully anticipated, and the cumulative strain on commanders and aircrews alike was amplified by the knowledge that a single error, misjudged trajectory, delayed scramble, or misinterpreted radar report might allow the Luftwaffe to strike with devastating effect. In this context, the German approach reveals a paradox: immense preparation and apparent precision, yet a reliance on factors that could falter at any moment, exposing fragility beneath apparent power. While British observers struggled to reconcile the scale of destruction with the uncertainty of what might come next, noting that even successful interceptions only postponed the inevitability of repeated bombardment, and every miscalculation threatened to magnify loss, both material and psychological, creating a tension that pervaded command rooms and control centers from London to regional RAF stations. And yet, within this pressure, subtle innovations emerged. The incremental improvement of radar tracking, more efficient allocation of fighter squadrons, and the careful timing of anti-aircraft fire all contributed to a web of resistance that was not apparent at first glance. Because the human eye tends to see only explosions and rubble, not the network of calculations, rotations, and contingency plans that preserved the fragile balance of defense. And these adjustments were informed by constant learning under fire, each raid providing data that was interpreted with urgency and caution, highlighting that survival depended less on brute force than on the disciplined, methodical execution of systems under relentless stress. And as historians now recognize, the Luftwaffe's apparent invincibility was as much an illusion as British confidence, for both sides operated on the knife edge of uncertainty, where overreach could produce catastrophic failure, and yet the interplay of strategic vision, improvisation, and resource management gradually allowed Britain to absorb attacks that might otherwise have collapsed a less adaptive society. And while the psychological pressure on the civilian population remained acute, the hidden reality was that the combination of foresight, adaptation, and resilience within the military apparatus was already beginning to counterbalance the weight of the Luftwaffe's offensive, revealing that behind the veil of terror, systems were quietly shaping survival in ways rarely acknowledged. A reminder that power and fragility are seldom mutually exclusive, and that in the calculus of war, minute advantages and rapid adjustments can mean the difference between collapse and endurance. Britain's defenses during the early months of the Blitz were a study in delicate balance, an intricate network stretched thin by geography, resources, and prior commitments across the empire. For while the public narrative suggests a robust readiness, the reality was that radar coverage was incomplete, fighter squadrons were dispersed, anti-aircraft artillery was often misaligned, and command structures were continually tested by the sheer tempo of Luftwaffe operations, creating a situation in which every deployment, every signal, and every decision carried disproportionate weight. The Royal Air Force, already fatigued by previous engagements over France and Dunkirk, faced not only physical exhaustion, but the psychological strain of knowing that the margin for error was vanishingly small. And the consequence of delay or miscalculation could cascade rapidly, for a single wave of bombers slipping past the radar network could devastate industrial districts, disrupt communications, and inflict civilian casualties that would amplify pressure on government and military alike, while civil defense measures, though impressive in scope, blackouts, shelters, volunteer fire watchers, were themselves imperfect and reliant upon disciplined adherence, and the illusion of security they provided was fragile, masking the constant danger just above rooftops. A danger that compounded each night, as raids varied unpredictably in intensity and target. In addition, the fog of war extended beyond visibility and instrumentation, for intelligence gathering was incomplete and sometimes misleading, with intercepted communications providing only partial insight into Luftwaffe plans. And the RAF's strategic planning depended upon rapid interpretation under extreme stress. Yet every successful interception reinforced confidence, even as every near miss reminded commanders and crews alike that collapse was always a possibility, that survival depended upon the coordination of numerous moving parts, each vulnerable to fatigue, error, or misjudgment, and the result was a heightened tension that permeated all levels of defense, from pilots scrambling in the early hours to officers coordinating rotations across multiple airfields. While the public, aware of air raid warnings, moved through a liminal space between reassurance and anxiety, their morale a critical, though intangible, component of national resilience, and this delicate ecosystem of preparedness. Improvisation and vigilance meant that small advantages, better radar interpretation, quicker scramble times, or even minor improvements in anti-aircraft accuracy could tip the balance, highlighting that power and fragility coexisted within every system, and that success was contingent on continuous, disciplined application under relentless pressure, while failure, even momentary, could have catastrophic consequences. It is within this context that Britain's defenses must be understood, not as invincible or heroic in the simplistic sense, but as an adaptive, strained, and constantly tested network whose effectiveness relied upon the careful interaction of technology, human judgment, and institutional structure, each element bearing the weight of survival. And as historians now recognize, the understated perseverance of these systems, operating at the edge of exhaustion, created the conditions under which Britain could endure the Blitz, reminding us that victory was never guaranteed, that confidence could be illusory, and that even small miscalculations could have tipped the island from resilience to disaster. A truth often softened in conventional accounts, yet evident in the meticulous records of operations, rotations, and responses that together reveal a nation holding precariously against overwhelming pressure. The civilian population, often reduced in popular accounts to passive observers or victims, was in truth an active, if largely unseen, component of Britain's survival during the Blitz. For Hitler's strategy relied not only upon physical destruction, but on the erosion of morale, exploiting the assumption that terror alone would fracture society. Yet what is rarely emphasized is the delicate psychological balance maintained by ordinary citizens, whose daily routines were suddenly punctuated by air raid warnings, blackouts, and the need to navigate shelters that were neither uniform nor entirely secure, creating an environment in which vigilance became instinct and exhaustion was constant, as the hours spent in confined spaces, waiting for the sound of approaching bombers, compounded the stress imposed by uncertainty and deprivation, while women, children, and the elderly took on roles that, although uncelebrated, were critical to sustaining essential services, maintaining communication, and ensuring that the urban fabric did not unravel under repeated assault and even minor lapses in discipline, forgotten blackout curtains, delayed firewatch rotations, or the failure to heed warning sirens, could have amplified damage exponentially, illustrating how closely the nation teetered on the edge of catastrophe, and yet these systems of civilian participation were often improvised, evolving in real time as raids exposed weaknesses, revealing the interplay between fragility and resilience that characterized Britain's response. For every citizen who endured the night's terror without panic contributed to a collective capacity to absorb further attacks, a factor that German strategists had underestimated, and the impact of propaganda, both British and German, added further complexity as misinformation, exaggeration, and concealment shaped perceptions of threat, sometimes heightening fear, sometimes masking critical vulnerabilities, thereby influencing behavior in ways that had tangible consequences for survival, while the constant drumbeat of uncertainty, whether a raid would be heavier than the last, whether an important factory would be targeted, whether communications would fail, maintained pressure on both the public and authorities, reinforcing that collapse was never distant from possibility, that every structural advantage could be compromised, and that endurance depended upon continuous attention to detail, rapid adaptation, and unspoken coordination across multiple layers of society, and this invisible theater of psychological warfare, waged silently in homes, streets, and workplaces, was as decisive as any aerial engagement, for the resilience of the populace directly affected operational efficiency, resource allocation, and morale of the armed forces, and the consequences of failure, though never fully realized, loomed with each warning siren, every blackout violation, every delayed emergency response, underscoring the interdependence of civilians and military in sustaining the nation. A reality often softened in historical narratives that focus on heroics or spectacular battles, yet it was in this quiet, continuous exertion, in the collective capacity to absorb terror without collapse, that Britain found a measure of stability, demonstrating that survival during the Blitz was never assured, that overconfidence could have led to disaster, and that the understated endurance of ordinary citizens created the foundation upon which military and strategic success rested, a truth that modern reflection can acknowledge without exaggeration. Recognizing the subtle but profound ways in which human discipline, vigilance, and adaptation under relentless psychological pressure shaped the outcome of one of the most dangerous periods in Britain's history. The Royal Air Force, often celebrated in general histories for its eventual successes, operated throughout the Blitz under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, resourcefulness, and technical ingenuity. And it is essential to understand that its effectiveness was never a given, but the product of rapid adaptation, meticulous coordination, and a continuous confrontation with fragility. For radar stations, still in relative infancy, required constant interpretation and recalibration, with operators working long hours under immense strain, knowing that a single misread signal could allow enemy bombers to penetrate urban defenses. While pilots faced repeated sorties in aircraft that, though technologically advanced for the time, demanded precision flying and instantaneous decision-making under threat of overwhelming force. And each engagement carried consequences far beyond the immediate skirmish, because downed aircraft meant lost crews, reduced operational capacity, and gaps in coverage that could be exploited in the next wave, highlighting the delicate interplay between human capability and technological support. And it was in this pressure cooker environment that small innovations, improved communication between radar posts and squadrons, more effective vectoring of fighters, and tactical adjustments in formation and altitude produced disproportionate effects, demonstrating that Britain's endurance relied on continuous learning under fire, on the disciplined execution of procedures that were tested to the limit, while each bomber intercepted, each enemy flight path disrupted, reinforced not merely tactical advantage but the fragile confidence underpinning both military and civilian belief in survival. Yet the margin remained narrow, for the Luftwaffe's raids were relentless, probing weaknesses, exploiting fatigue and attempting to stretch defenses beyond capacity, and the RAF's success depended as much on timing, rotation, and stamina as on aircraft performance or pilot skill, underscoring that resilience was systemic rather than heroic, a product of discipline, improvisation, and persistent attention to detail. And as raids continued, the cumulative psychological pressure intensified, with every pilot aware that a single lapse could cost lives and compromise entire sectors of defense, while planners simultaneously juggled finite resources, ensuring ammunition, fuel, and repair facilities kept pace with operational tempo. And this delicate equilibrium, constantly threatened by attrition, miscommunication, or sudden enemy advantage, revealed the persistent tension between confidence and fragility that defined Britain's aerial defense. For even minor oversights could have resulted in strategic collapse, yet the system endured, not by chance but through the relentless application of technical expertise, procedural discipline, and adaptive thinking under pressure, illustrating that survival was contingent upon a network of interdependent elements functioning under extreme stress, and that each success masked the proximity of failure, reinforcing the psychological truth that Britain's position was always tenuous, that one decision, one delay, one mechanical fault might have reversed fortunes. And it is this combination of pressure, adaptation, and careful exploitation of advantage that explains why the RAF, though exhausted and stretched, remained capable of blunting Hitler's Blitz, a fact that is often understated yet fundamental to understanding the survival of Britain during one of its darkest and most dangerous campaigns. By the autumn of 1940, certain pivotal moments had begun to shift the momentum of the Blitz, though these shifts were subtle, contingent, and frequently obscured by the broader narrative of relentless bombing, for the outcome remained far from assured and depended upon a convergence of circumstance, planning, and human endurance, with each engagement offering both peril and opportunity. The Luftwaffe, despite its impressive scale and coordination, began to encounter the limits of its operational reach, with longer missions straining crews, aircraft, and navigation, while British responses grew incrementally more sophisticated, incorporating lessons drawn from earlier raids into improved interception patterns, better communication between radar stations and squadrons, and more effective allocation of fighters across threatened sectors. Yet even these adjustments required constant vigilance and were never foolproof, for a single lapse could have yielded devastating consequences. And as industrial targets were alternately struck and missed, the Germans' inability to consistently dismantle key infrastructure meant that civilian and military systems, though damaged, retained functionality, allowing for repair, replenishment, and continued coordination. And this fragile equilibrium, maintained under extreme pressure, illustrates how the line between near collapse and continued survival was narrower than most accounts convey. With small advantages, an unexpected diversion of bombers, an early warning from a radar post, a rapid repair of an airfield, having effects disproportionate to their scale, highlighting the systemic rather than heroic nature of Britain's endurance, while the psychological strain remained constant, both among civilians, who endured nightly alerts in shelters, and among pilots and commanders, whose decisions were amplified in consequence by the unrelenting tempo of attacks, and in this period, the interplay between overconfidence and fragility became starkly evident, with both sides making assumptions that could, and sometimes did, misfire, for even minor miscalculations in timing, target selection, or response allocation could have triggered cascading failures. Yet Britain's capacity to absorb the pressure was reinforced by an adaptive system, a continuous recalibration of tactics, and an unspoken understanding of risk among those charged with defending the nation, which in turn created a psychological buffer against despair, though never eliminating the possibility of disaster. Historians now recognize that these weeks represented a critical turning point, not because of any single heroic intervention, but because of the cumulative effect of disciplined responses, incremental innovation, and the subtle application of intelligence and observation, a combination that consistently blunted German objectives while maintaining the operational integrity of military and civil institutions. And as the raids continued, patterns emerged that allowed the British to anticipate movements, concentrate forces effectively, and minimize civilian disruption, all under conditions of severe resource limitation, fatigue, and uncertainty. And it is this persistent, systemic adaptation, rather than any single act of valor, that accounts for the gradual shift in momentum, revealing that the balance of power in the Blitz was as much a product of careful management under strain as it was of technological or numerical superiority, and it serves as a reminder that survival, in this context, was never guaranteed, that the line between endurance and collapse was perilously thin, and that Britain's eventual capacity to withstand Hitler's aerial onslaught depended upon a convergence of vigilance, discipline, an unheralded yet decisive human and organizational effort. The aftermath of the Blitz reveals a series of hidden costs and often overlooked triumphs that conventional histories tend to soften, for while the destruction of property, the loss of life, and the disruption of daily life were plainly visible, the subtler consequences, psychological strain, displacement, and the erosion of industrial efficiency were no less significant. And yet these same pressures also illuminated the understated mechanisms of survival that kept Britain functioning. For systems that might appear mundane, civil defense coordination, repair teams, communication networks, rationing logistics were tested continuously, each delay or error carrying the potential to magnify the impact of subsequent raids. And within this interplay of fragility and resilience, the endurance of ordinary citizens and military personnel alike becomes evident, revealing that triumph was rarely spectacular, but often procedural, measured, and painstakingly maintained, while morale, a frequently underestimated factor, was sustained by a combination of practical support, disciplined adherence to protocols, and the quiet awareness that failure in one area could propagate rapidly across others. Yet despite these successes, the nation was never secure, and each day's survival was contingent upon the cumulative performance of numerous interdependent systems. From radar stations accurately tracking incoming formations to fire brigades responding swiftly to incendiary attacks, and even small lapses could have had catastrophic consequences, illustrating how delicate the balance truly was. And the human element remained central, for the endurance of structures, communications, and defenses depended upon the alertness, stamina, and adaptability of those operating within them, while German attempts to undermine cohesion, exploit weaknesses, or induce panic were mitigated only by the disciplined and sometimes improvisational responses of both officials and civilians, revealing the psychological dimension of survival, one where anticipation, timing, and rapid decision-making were decisive even when invisible. And yet the records indicate that not every operation succeeded, that misjudgments, equipment failures, and miscommunications occasionally brought near disasters that, while ultimately contained, served as stark reminders of the ever-present fragility underlying apparent stability. And this pattern underscores the broader historical lesson that victory was never assured, and that the perception of strength often masked a series of near failures averted by minute margins. While the human and systemic costs of maintaining operational continuity left long-term consequences in health, social cohesion, and industrial output, effects that were felt well beyond the immediate period of raids. And these hidden costs, alongside the understated yet decisive acts of endurance, highlight the duality of Britain's experience during the Blitz, demonstrating that what appears as triumph in retrospective accounts was built upon a foundation of tension, fatigue, and continuous adaptation, and that survival was less about heroism and more about the interplay between systems, discipline, and human resolve under extreme pressure, a a nuanced reality often softened or omitted in conventional narratives, yet crucial to understanding the full measure of Britain's achievement. For it reminds us that power and fragility coexisted at every level, that every procedural success was the product of sustained attention under threat, and that what history sometimes labels as inevitable was, in fact, a tenuous balance maintained through constant vigilance, resourcefulness, and the quiet but unrelenting endurance of a nation under siege. The conclusion of the Blitz leaves a legacy defined less by the drama of destruction and more by the measured endurance of systems and people operating under relentless strain. For while conventional accounts often emphasize heroic sorties or iconic speeches, the reality rests in the quiet, continuous management of risk, the meticulous coordination of defenses, and the incremental learning under fire that allowed Britain to remain intact despite repeated attempts at strategic collapse. And it is in examining these elements, the calibrated responses of the Royal Air Force, the disciplined vigilance of civilians, the adaptive use of radar, the rotation of limited resources, and the unheralded improvisations across industrial, logistical, and civil structures, that the true nature of survival emerges, revealing that each day, each engagement, and each decision was a precarious balance between overconfidence and fragility, between endurance and failure, and that the line separating collapse from continuity was often thinner than contemporaries could imagine, with delays, misjudgments, or even minor miscommunications threatening to unravel months of planning and effort. Yet within this pressure, Britain's adaptive capacity consistently turned potential disaster into sustained survival, illustrating a form of resilience grounded not in mythology or exaggerated heroism, but in disciplined, systemic performance under extreme conditions. And while the physical and psychological toll was considerable, destroyed homes, disrupted communities, lost lives, and the strain of constant uncertainty, the nation's ability to maintain coherence and functionality highlights the understated yet decisive interplay of human decision-making, institutional structure, and technological application. A combination that allowed strategic and tactical advantages to be leveraged, small gains to accumulate, and threats to be mitigated before they escalated into catastrophe. And historians, revisiting these weeks, now recognize that Britain's endurance was contingent upon this convergence of factors rather than any single brilliant act, that the seeming inevitability of survival was in fact a fragile construct, maintained only through vigilance, adaptation, and the sustained exertion of countless individuals whose contributions, while often invisible, were critical to the nation's capacity to withstand repeated attacks. And the legacy of this period is therefore not simply one of victory, but of reflection, for it demonstrates that even the strongest systems are subject to strain, that overconfidence may disguise fragility, and that endurance often depends upon unseen labor, measured response, and a continuous assessment of risk. And in acknowledging this complexity, the story of Britain's fight under the Blitz provides not only a historical lesson, but a psychological insight into how nations survive under extreme pressure, reminding us that what appears inevitable is frequently contingent upon countless decisions made under duress, and that the balance of power and fragility can shift with the smallest miscalculation. And as we reflect upon these weeks, it is fitting to consider not only the acts that are commemorated, but the systems, structures, and disciplined efforts that sustained a nation under relentless threat. And for those who wish to explore this history in its full depth, understanding the fragile margins and hidden mechanisms of endurance, I invite you to continue this exploration with us here on Backhand Index, pointing right Britain at war.